Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into speciation.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's that incredible process that's given us like all the mind-boggling diversity of life on Earth.
It really is amazing.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at a couple of research papers
Huh.
and also some lecture notes just to try to figure out how new species emerge both with and without geographic separation.
Sounds good.
Buckle up. This is going to be a wild ride.
It is amazing to consider that every species that we see today, from like the tiniest microbe to the largest whale, like they all came about through this process.
That's wild.
It's still happening all around us, constantly shaping the future of life on Earth.
So let's start with the basics. Like, what's the core ingredient that kicks off this whole speciation process?
Okay.
I mean, how do you go from one species to two?
Well, it all hinges on what we call reproductive isolation.
Okay.
Those mechanisms that prevent different species from interbreeding, or if they do interbreed, they don't produce offspring that can survive and reproduce themselves.
Like that whole horse, donkey, mule situation. You
Great
get that
examples.
hybrid, but it's a dead end on that evolutionary road.
Yeah, that's a great example, and that's an example of post-zygotic isolation.
Post-zygotic. Okay.
But there are also prezygotic barriers, which stop things before they even get to that point,
Okay.
like different mating rituals or incompatible reproductive parts.
So it's like a whole series of hurdles for these new species to overcome.
Yeah, it is.
And you know what? Our sources actually have a really helpful visual
Okay.
in Evolution Lecture 3.pdf that breaks down all these different barriers.
Nice.
So we've got, habitat isolation where species just never meet.
Right.
Temporal isolation where they breed at different times.
Yeah.
And even cases where the sperm and egg just can't fuse because they have incompatible proteins.
Yeah, like sea urchins, for example.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
They release their sperm and eggs right into the water.
Oh, wow.
So for fertilization to happen, the sperm and egg, they need to recognize each other at a molecular level. But different species of sea urchins, they have different proteins on their gametes.
Gotcha.
So they're essentially incompatible.
So it's like trying to put together a puzzle using pieces from different sets.
Exactly.
Okay, so all these barriers, they're keeping species distinct. But how do those new species actually form in the first place?
So one of the most common ways is allopatric speciation.
Okay.
Picture this. You have a population, let's say, of squirrels, and they get divided by some geographical barrier. It
Okay.
could be a mountain range, a river, even a new highway.
So like being separated from your friends and family, you might start developing, different customs, different ways of life, and eventually it's hard to imagine rejoining that original group.
Exactly. Now, those isolated squirrel populations, they're on their own evolutionary paths. They're going to face different environments, different predators, different food sources, all of which can drive them to evolve in distinct ways.
So I'm picturing like one group up in the mountains surviving on pine cones,
Okay.
and the other down in the valley is feasting on acorns. And over time, they might develop different teeth foraging behaviors, maybe even camouflage.
That's it. And given enough time, those two squirrel populations could become so distinct that even if that barrier disappeared, they wouldn't recognize each other as the same species, let alone interbreed.
It's like they've become two completely different cultures.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
So Evolution Lecture 3.pdf actually mentions the Isthmus of Panama,
Okay.
that thin strip of land connecting North and South America.
Right?
It actually separated populations of snapping shrimp millions of years ago.
And as a result, we see pairs of closely related snapping shrimp species
Oh, wow.
on opposite sides of the isthmus.
Okay.
And, they look very similar, but their genes tell a different story.
Interesting.
They've been evolving in isolation, unable to interbreed for millions of years.
That's incredible. So that's allopatric speciation.
Right.
But then there's that other kind of mind-bending way that new species arise.
Right.
Sympatric speciation.
Yes. This is where things get even more intriguing. It's when new species emerge within the same geographic area.
Really?
Yeah. So think of it like this. Allopatric speciation is a puzzle splitting into two,
Okay.
while sympatric speciation is like a new puzzle piece appearing within the existing one.
That's wild. How does that even happen?
Well, it's not about physical separation. It's about those other factors that can drive reproductive isolation.
Like what?
Differences in habitat preference, food sources, or even mate choice.
Oh, okay.
Imagine a population of birds where some develop a strong preference for nesting in a particular type of tree, while others stick to the traditional nesting sites.
Got it. So even though they're all in the same forest, they're segregating themselves based on nesting choices. But
Exactly.
how does that lead to new species?
Well, if those preferences are linked to mating behavior, you can see how reproductive isolation could take hold.
Okay.
For example, females might only choose to mate with males that share their nesting preference.
Oh, interesting.
And over time, that can lead to two distinct lineages of birds that rarely interbreed.
It's like a Romeo and Juliet situation, but instead of feuding families, it's feuding nesting preferences.
Right. And, our sources mention a really cool example of this with cichlid fish in Lake Victoria.
Oh, really?
Yeah, those fish are famous for their rapid speciation.
Hmm.
And figure 24.12 shows how different cichlid species in Lake Victoria are distinguished by male coloration.
Okay.
And females, they prefer to mate with males of a specific color,
Oh, wow.
which has led to reproductive isolation between these color-based groups.
So even a seemingly simple preference like color can drive the emergence of new species. Fascinating.
It really is.
Speaking of interesting ways that new species pop up, what about polyploidy?
Polyploidy is a unique mechanism where an organism ends up with extra sets of chromosomes
Okay.
due to errors during cell division.
So instead of the usual 2 sets of chromosomes,
Right.
they might have 3 or 4?
They might.
Isn't that usually a problem?
It can be, but imagine you're baking cookies and you accidentally double the recipe.
Okay.
You might end up with a completely different cookie,
Yeah,
but it could be even better than the original.
that's a great analogy.
So polyploidy can be like a recipe for evolutionary innovation,
Okay.
leading to new species with unique traits.
Interesting.
And figure 24.10 shows a classic example of this in the plant genus Trigopogon.
Okay.
Through hybridization and errors in cell division, new polyploid species have emerged essentially overnight in evolutionary terms.
Oh, wow.
That's right. Polyploidy offers a fast track to speciation, at least for some species. But what happens when closely related species, whether they form through polyploidy or other means, start to intermingle again?
Oh, okay.
That's where we get into the fascinating world of hybrid zones.
Hybrid zone. Okay, those areas where species collide. What happens in these evolutionary melting pots?
Hybrid zones are regions where members of different species meet and mate, producing at least some offspring of mixed ancestry.
Okay.
These zones can be narrow or wide,
Okay.
and their fate is often uncertain. Yeah, they can lead to the reinforcement of barriers between species,
Oh, okay.
the fusion of two species back into one, or even the formation of entirely new species.
So it's like a crossroads in evolution.
Yes,
Do the hybrids create their own paths, strengthen the existing paths, or cause a merge?
exactly. And our sources have a couple of great examples that illustrate the different possibilities.
Okay.
Figure 24.13 shows a narrow hybrid zone where two toad species, the fire-bellied and yellow-bellied, meet.
Okay.
The hybrids aren't as fit as either parent species in their respective habitats, so the zone remains narrow.
It's like an evolutionary no man's land. The hybrids are caught in the middle, not quite belonging to either side.
Precisely. And that limited fitness helps maintain the distinction between the two parent species.
Hmm.
But, the environment can also play a big role in shaping the fate of hybrid zones.
I bet. What happens when the environment throws a wrench into the works? Does it make things even more complicated?
Absolutely. For instance, figure 24.14 shows how the hybrid zone between black-capped and Carolina chickadees is shifting northward due to climate change.
Really?
Yeah, this is impacting the interactions between these two species
Wow.
and could have significant implications for their evolutionary futures.
It's like the environment is constantly reshaping the evolutionary landscape, creating new challenges and opportunities for species to adapt and diverge. This whole concept of speciation is so dynamic. It's amazing to think that it's happening all around us, even as we speak.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore when it comes to understanding the intricacies of speciation and the incredible diversity it's generated.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're knee-deep in this fascinating world of speciation, exploring how new species arise from existing ones. Before we went on, we were discussing how those environmental shifts can really shake things up in the hybrid zones,
Yeah, it really can.
creating some, unexpected evolutionary outcomes.
Absolutely. Evolution is all about this constant interplay between life and its environment. And hybrid zones are like windows into that process,
Yeah, they're really fascinating.
showing us how those species boundaries can blur and shift.
So far, we've talked about allopatric and sympatric speciation,
Right.
but I'm curious, are there other more subtle ways that reproductive isolation can emerge and set the stage for speciation?
Besides physical separation and the remarkable phenomena of sympatric speciation, there are many subtle ways that reproductive isolation can arise. Think about those prezygotic barriers we discussed earlier, like differences in mating rituals or timing, for example.
Right.
Those differences can evolve even without physical separation.
So those ships passing in the night scenarios can play out even when species share the same space.
Precisely. Let's say you have a population of birds, and some individuals start singing a slightly different mating song.
Oh, okay.
Maybe a faster tempo, a new note, or even a slight shift in pitch.
So they're like remixing the classic love song,
Yeah,
and not all the birds are digging the new beat.
exactly. If females start developing a preference for one song over the other, you're witnessing the very beginnings of reproductive isolation, right there within the same population.
It's like a musical rift in the bird community,
Right.
potentially leading to two separate lineages, each with their own unique soundtrack.
Yeah.
I imagine this kind of thing can happen with any trait that influences mate choice,
Absolutely.
not just songs.
It could be variations in plumage, elaborate courtship displays, or even subtle differences in scent.
Oh, wow.
These seemingly small changes can have a huge impact on reproductive compatibility and set the stage for the emergence of new species.
Okay.
And this brings us to a fascinating aspect of this whole discussion, the concept of species itself. You might be surprised to learn that defining a species isn't always as straightforward as it seems.
Wait, really? I thought a species was simply a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring.
Right.
Isn't that the classic definition?
That's the biological species concept,
Yeah.
and it's a useful starting point. But it doesn't always hold up, especially when we're dealing with extinct organisms, species that reproduce asexually, or cases where hybridization is common.
So the lines get a little blurry sometimes.
They do.
What are some other ways to define a species if interbreeding isn't the only factor?
Well, we have the morphological species concept, which relies on physical characteristics,
Okay.
and the phylogenetic species concept, which focuses on evolutionary history and shared ancestry. It's like we're looking at the concept of a species through different lenses, each highlighting different aspects and challenges.
So sometimes these different lenses might lead to different conclusions about how many species actually exist.
Exactly. Take grizzly bears and polar bears, for instance.
Okay.
They can sometimes interbreed, but based on their distinct morphology, behavior, and evolutionary history, they're generally considered separate species.
So it's like a detective story, piecing together clues from different fields to unravel the mysteries of speciation.
That's a great analogy. We rely on evidence from paleontology, genetics, ecology, and even behavior to understand how new species arise. Fossils offer us a window into the past, allowing us to trace lineages and extinctions. Genetic analysis helps us understand relatedness between species and pinpoint when they diverged, and observations in the field give us valuable insights into how reproductive isolation plays out in real-world settings.
Speaking of real-world examples, one of our sources mentions a study on reproductive isolation between geographically separated salamander populations.
Okay.
Even though they're closely related, these salamanders have evolved distinct courtship rituals that prevent them from interbreeding.
Yes, it highlights how behavioral differences can act as powerful reproductive barriers driving the formation of new species.
Wow.
It's amazing how all these different pieces of the puzzle fit together to paint a more complete picture of evolution. But I have to admit, it's hard to wrap my head around the immense timescales involved in speciation. We're talking millions of years, right?
I know. It's hard to even fathom those kinds of time spans. Are there any ways to make these vast stretches of time more relatable?
One approach is to use analogies. Imagine compressing Earth's history into a single year.
Okay, I like where this is going. So if Earth formed on January 1st, when would humans show up in this Earth year?
Humans wouldn't appear until very late in the game, around 11:59 p.m. on December 31st.
Wow, that really puts things in perspective. We're just a blip on the radar of Earth's history.
Exactly. The vast majority of speciation events occurred long before we came along, but we can still study them using fossils, genetic data, and molecular clocks, which allow us to estimate the timing of divergence events based on the rate of genetic mutations.
So it's like using genetic mutations as a kind of evolutionary timekeeper.
Precisely. And by comparing genetic data from different species, we can construct those family trees of life, phylogenetic trees that show evolutionary relationships. These trees reveal fascinating patterns of speciation over time, showcasing the interconnectedness of all living things.
It's like piecing together an epic family reunion, but for all of life. But speaking of time, I'm curious, how do scientists actually study speciation in action? We can't just sit around for millions of years and watch it happen.
That's where things get really exciting. While we can't usually observe the entire process of speciation in real time, there are ways to study it indirectly and even witness some aspects of it unfolding. One way is to study populations undergoing rapid diversification, such as those on islands or in other isolated environments.
Ah, islands. Those evolutionary hotbeds where new species seem to pop up all the time.
They're like natural laboratories where we can observe evolution in action. Islands often have simpler ecological structures and fewer competing species compared to continents.
So it's like watching evolution play out on a smaller, more manageable stage.
Exactly. By comparing populations on different islands, researchers can gain insights into what drives diversification and how reproductive isolation takes hold.
It's like having multiple natural experiments running in parallel with each island telling its own unique evolutionary story.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just islands. Other isolated habitats like lakes, mountaintops, and even fragmented forests offer valuable glimpses into the dynamics of speciation.
Anywhere you have isolation and limited gene flow, you have the potential for incredible evolutionary innovation. But I think we're about ready for another quick pause. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into how scientists study speciation in action and uncover some truly remarkable examples of evolution at work. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been exploring this amazing world of speciation, and before the break, we were talking about how scientists use islands and other isolated areas like natural laboratories to study evolution in action. It's incredible to think we can actually observe these processes happening, even if it takes thousands or even millions of years for a new species to fully emerge.
Yeah, these natural laboratories, they offer us a glimpse into the forces that shape biodiversity.
Okay.
And one of the most fascinating ways to witness the gradual unfolding of speciation is through something called ring species.
Ring species,
Right.
okay.
Imagine a chain of populations, each capable of interbreeding with its neighbors,
Okay.
forming a ring around a geographic barrier. Now here's the twist.
Okay.
The populations at the two ends of the ring,
Right.
though they share a common ancestor, have diverged so much that they can no longer interbreed.
So it's like a game of evolutionary telephone where the message changes subtly with each whisper until it's like completely transformed. Do you have a real life example of this?
A classic example is the Ensatina salamander complex in California.
Okay.
These salamanders, they form a ring around the Central Valley.
Okay.
While neighboring populations can hybridize,
Right.
those at the northern and southern ends of the ring are reproductively isolated, effectively making them separate species.
So ring species provide a snapshot of speciation in progress, showing how small changes can accumulate over time and distance to create those distinct boundaries between species. It really highlights the idea that speciation is often a continuous process,
Right.
not a sudden jump.
Exactly. It's a journey with many steps.
Yeah.
And studying those steps helps us understand the intricate mechanisms that drive the diversity of life.
Okay, so we've talked about the different types of speciation, the challenges of defining a species, the role of environmental change, and even those fascinating ring species.
Right.
But I have a question that's been on my mind.
Okay.
Like, why should we as non-scientists care about speciation? What's the significance of all this for our everyday lives?
That's a great question. Understanding speciation goes beyond simply knowing how new species arise.
Right.
It's about grasping the very essence of biodiversity,
Okay.
the interconnectedness of life and our place within this grand evolutionary story.
So it's not just about the science itself, but about the implications for understanding the natural world and our role within it.
Precisely. For example, understanding speciation helps us appreciate the delicate balance of ecosystems.
Okay.
Habitat loss, climate change, invasive species. These disruptions can interfere with the processes of speciation and lead to extinctions, ultimately diminishing the richness of life on Earth.
So this knowledge equips us to understand the impact of our actions on the environment and make more informed decisions about conservation.
Exactly. It allows us to prioritize the protection of vulnerable habitats and mitigate the negative consequences of human activities on the natural world.
Okay, that's a powerful reason to care about speciation. It's not just an abstract concept, it's directly relevant to our responsibility as stewards of the planet.
And here's another fascinating layer to consider:
Okay.
the potential for speciation to occur in response to human-induced changes.
Oh, wow.
As we alter environments, introduce new species, and even modify organisms through genetic engineering, we're essentially becoming agents of evolutionary change ourselves.
Wow. That's a pretty profound thought. We're not just observers of speciation, but potentially drivers of it as well.
That's right. And that raises important questions about the potential consequences of our actions on the evolutionary trajectories of other species.
Yeah.
It compels us to consider our ethical responsibilities for the biodiversity we inherit and shape.
Those are some big questions to ponder. It seems like understanding speciation opens up a whole new realm of ethical considerations about our relationship with the natural world.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're part of an interconnected web of life, and our actions have far-reaching consequences. But beyond the ethical dimension, let's not forget the sheer wonder and awe that speciation inspires. The incredible diversity of life on Earth,
Yeah.
the countless adaptations, the intricate relationships. It's a story that never gets old.
It really is awe-inspiring. This entire deep dive has been a journey through the remarkable creativity and resilience of life. And the best part is the story's still unfolding.
Right.
New species are emerging even now, perhaps, in places we least expect, reminding us that the journey of discovery never ends.
Exactly. And as we delve deeper into the mechanisms of speciation, we gain a richer understanding of the intricate tapestry of life and our place within it.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? The next time you step outside, take a moment to really observe the natural world around you. Look for the subtle differences between individuals, consider the challenges they face, and imagine the possibilities for change. Who knows, you might even spot the subtle hints of speciation in action, a glimpse into the ongoing evolution of life on Earth.
That's the beauty of it. Speciation is happening all around us. It's a constant reminder that the natural world is dynamic, ever-changing, and full of surprises.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the wonders of speciation and the profound implications it holds for understanding the evolution of life. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.